Hi, I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and I'm so thrilled today to be joined by Daria Polatin, who is the showrunner as well as author of the original book of Devil in Ohio. And I wanted to start by talking about the way in which you've told this story, which is based on true events, and you had access to have conversations early on. It sounds like in developing the novel with one of the centralized characters that is in the book, the character of Jules. But at the same time, you really gave yourself that creative freedom in terms of fictionalizing the way that you told this story. And then I was interested in developing a TV show off the back of that, how that also even just further opened up a lot of the space and the ways in which you feel you were able to tell this story episodically with having that real foundational root of truth, but giving yourself the creative freedom narratively.
Yeah, that's a great question. The initial seeds of the story came from a true story that our producer, Rachel Miller, heard that actually took place in Ohio. And she told me this story, and I thought, that is fabulous. I have to tell this story. So I took the idea of that and fictionalized it in order to free myself up creatively. The book was told mostly, was in the YA space, young adult space, and we told it through the point of view of Jules, the teenage daughter. So we really get to get inside her head. It's very interior. It's a coming of age story. She's trying to find who she is. Meanwhile, this girl comes in around her age who has this sort of enigmatic magnetism, and Jules becomes very enthralled with her, and they end up becoming very close, and then so close that Jules starts to feel like she's being edged out by this girl, and you get that sort of single white female vibes in the book. And so moving into the series, it was a wonderful way to keep that and build on it. We don't lose, any of that, but we get to break it open and crack open the world. And I was also really interested, after writing the book creatively, moving to series, I was really interested in looking at Suzanne, the psychiatrist's mother, and trying to, and digging deeper into why she takes this girl home. What happened to her that she feels so connected with this girl, and how far will she go to protect this young woman in her own home, even when her own family is starting to unravel. So for me, the question of the series was really looking at Suzanne as our protagonist and looking at how far, she would go to protect this young woman. We still, of course, keep that intrigue and mystery of May, wondering, is she a force for good or is she a force for evil? And that is a question that we ask up until the very last moments of the show.
And with what you're talking about there in terms of, shifting the perspective and the way that you're bringing us into the story for an episodic telling of it, I imagine that there was an element of kind of having to not be precious about your own work. And it's such a fascinating exercise in terms of that, and you've written for screen, in television, film, theater, novels, but it's such a unique exercise to go to one of your novels and then to adapt it into an episodic telling. And so how did you approach revisiting your own material and going through and making choices like you did of, okay, well, if we shift the perspective of the central story and how we're coming into it, and just some of the other details, like you said, it's very interior in the book. So I'm sure that there were things that you would have loved to include that just didn't really translate over to the screen in the way you would have loved.
100%. So on the plus side, I had spent so much time with these characters. I lived inside some of their heads. I knew what the house looked like. I'd done a lot of that in-depth character work, and starting to dig into their psychology and their language and all of that. So that was great. And the overarching idea of the story, the thrust of the story of the book as well. That was our jumping off point, because as you said, certain things translate to a different medium and certain things don't. And, what makes an exciting a book isn't the same as what makes an exciting TV show. So I brought my, TV brain, and I've been writing TV shows for a while now, and got to bring that sort of lens to the storytelling. And also just, the book was in the YA space, but the series is a, adult and, all inclusive, or mature teens and above. But so because of that, then we get to lean into Suzanne's marriage and her relationship with her husband, and look at her husband who's trying to make ends meet and protect his family. And then we also have the Detective Lopez storyline, as he's sleuthing around Town and trying to find out what's going on there. And, he ends up being a little bit of a partner with Suzanne on figuring out that, what's happening and what happened to May and what's going to happen. So we really got to break open the world there, which was really fun. And when you do that, the characters and story take on a life of their own. You have to be willing to go with where they lead you, and find what those ultimate conclusions are, and learn about them as you go. So I had a wonderful writer's room, and especially my other executive producer, Andrew Wilder, who, I really leaned on to like kick the tires with me, and really like, do we let this go? Do we keep this? And I really kick the tires on everything, because if I don't, then somebody else will. And I won't be able to do anything about it. So I'm very rigorous, as rigorous as I can be with my storytelling. And, in TV, you really learn not to be precious about things. There are a lot of creative cooks in the kitchen, overall. And then once you get into the different elements of it, you have production, and you didn't think you didn't imagine it would be raining, for a scene, but it's raining. And so it's raining in the scene, like you can't do anything about it. And so you have to just kind of go with the flow of it. I really do. There's that saying that you write a script 3 times. You write it on the page, you write it when you're filming it, and you write it in editing. And I think that's really true, is, I come from playwriting, and, put everything on the page that you can. You give it, I try to give as much as I can to the actors, and give them as much detail and depth and 3-dimensionality and emotionality and all, everything that I can give them on this document, to send them off on their journey of continuing to passing the baton, of continuing to create the character. And but then they're going to inhabit it, and every way an actor inhabits a role is just going to bring on its own tone and specificity in a way that's really wonderful and special. And Emily, I actually went to college with Emily Deschanel, and we studied theater together at Boston University. So we knew each other, and we had been in a play together, before, and we were friends. So it was really, I gave her as much information as I could. And then she also, brought her own elements to the character, and, came up with some other details about her past that we actually worked into the show. So it was a collaborative space that I try to set up, with the actors. And, Gerardo Chalasco came in to play Detective Lopez. He's El Salvadoran. I said, let's make the character, from El Salvador, do you want to do that? And he was like, yes. And so, we got to really like tailor, work together with all the different, people involved in making the show. And then, going back to your original question, when you get to editing, you have what you have. And if you didn't get that shot, you didn't get that shot. And you have to sort of rethink, if something doesn't work, like, you have to kill your darlings, you know, you have to figure out a way around it. You know, you can certainly fix certain things. You can ADR, you can put music in, you know, that you can, you know, change the tone of a scene. Like there's the possibilities are really infinite in editing. I like to actually think of it as writing in, well, it's almost in 4D, right? Because there's time, but you're writing sort of in this like with this 3D world. You're recreating the scene, and so yeah, so it's a matter of like coming in with vision and history and ideas, and then also being open to what the life that the show takes on of its own, and confident enough in the story that it will evolve, and it will tell us what it wants to be. And sometimes it's not exactly what you think or what you had in mind, and it can surprise you. So it was a really exciting process. You know, I've adapted other people's work, and to adapt my own work was really such a treat. So I look forward to doing it again, creating more IP so I can adapt it again.
I love that. And you were bringing up within that as well, the different narrative threads that exist and the different almost styles of storytelling that exist within the show, you know, and they really coexist and interlace so successfully. And you've got that detective element, you've got family interpersonal drama, you know, there's the kind of thriller and suspense element of the unknown with May's story and where she comes from as we get to know a little bit more about that. And so how did you approach telling a story which is interlacing and weaving together these different styles of story making, but in a way that ultimately needs to feel very cohesive in the way it did?
Yeah, I mean, that was the creative challenge of the show, is to have these different elements and worlds and still still sync them together. You know, honestly, on a very technical level, on the page when I wrote it, I would write the pre-lap sounds and you know, the cuts of it didn't always translate to production through the edit, but like in executing it on the page, I, you know, created these transitions from scene to scene. Birds squawking turns into student chatter at the high school, you know. Now, again, that didn't always end up in what you see on the screen, but the idea that these worlds were connected, even if they felt like different worlds. But you know, we tried to you know, music, sound, we paid a lot of attention to sound. You know, sometimes in an uncomfortable moment with Jules, a locker slams, right? It's like that little jolt of, or an egg cracks, right? We tried to kind of use some of those other elements to carry through the vibe. Even if the scene was about something else, we're trying to bring in those juxtapositions. You know, there's also a scene with Suzanne and May, and they're in a diner, and they're kind of get into some darker, you know, conversation, but there you kind of hear the tinkle of like the song on the loudspeaker on the radio, you know, like, and it's just a little like unsettling. So I find those really interesting, those juxtapositions. So it was really fun to be able to play with them, you know, on the page, but and then again in 3D with all of our elements, in taking what we had from production and then post-production.
And in going back to something that you were saying earlier with the character of May, that you're kind of playing that element of what are her intentions right up until the end of the final episode of the season. I wanted to talk as well about the way in which you give us information and kind of where you delineated, okay, we need to give the audience a little bit more, but maybe we still need to hold this piece of information back because, if we go back to the beginning of her arc, at the beginning, we don't even know her name. She hasn't said a single word. Then we get it's like, then we see the marking on the back, then we get a little bit of detail. And then, you take us physically to the location of where she comes from. So we start to see little glimpses and little elements from outsider's eyes. We see little inside moments. And I thought it did such a great job at really giving you enough to kind of keep you getting more information, but never giving you too much that you feel like you know it all early on. And so was that something that in the script writing process, you felt like you really had a clear idea of, or was it something that, like you were saying, with the fact that you're writing it again in production and writing it again in editing, that you were always finessing a little bit?
I think we were fairly clear on the page. I mean, I actually we wrote all the episodes before we started filming. That was very important to me too. And we the way that the structure of the writer's room and then production, that's how it worked out. But I wanted to get it as solid on the page as we possibly could, because once you get into production and everything's moving around, like this show is it's like an 8-part movie, everything's really woven. There's little pieces, there's Easter eggs, there's little threads of things, tiny little details that come back. You may or may not notice, but they're there and they'll come back later. So it was important to me to really craft the storytelling as much as possible on the page before even going into shooting. So I do think that the flow of information stayed pretty much the same. The way that I looked at it was, in terms of information, was seeing it through mostly Suzanne's eyes and kind of learning with her. Sometimes there are things we learn with Jules, and then sometimes there are things we learn with Detective Lopez. But overall, we're looking at it through Suzanne's point of view. And so we're kind of getting the pieces that she gets, in that amount of time. It's a fairly condensed timeline. I mean, spans, a couple of months, like September to November. We just wanted it to feel kind of natural. A lot of times you're watching something that's very hyper, realistic, and things are happening very quickly and unraveling very quickly. And sometimes they do, but sometimes in life they are more of a slower burn, and you're not sure, and you get some information and you live with it a little bit, and then you're like, wait, that was kind of weird, like processing kind of. So we tried to, it's a grounded drama with psychological thriller or suspense elements, but we tried to aim for the sort of realistic grounded drama first, and the other elements come as they naturally in that story flow out.
That's so interesting. And in terms of the dynamic between May and Suzanne, again, we don't necessarily know the details of the trauma in her past that's driving Suzanne into making this decision at the beginning. But even when we don't know the why, we still understand that there's this necessary drive, and there's this kind of like emotional connectivity and something that she sees in her. And even just from the detailing, from the way that she keeps looking at the scar on her wrist, we know there's something there. We see very early on, okay, this is someone who just has a real need to try and save other people in a certain way. And that clearly comes from somewhere. And so how did you approach making sure that the audience always understood this decision, even as it starts to have adverse effects on her family, even before we get the detailing of some of the childhood trauma that really is the reason that drives this?
Well, it was very important to us, even before Emily became involved, just as writers, to protect Suzanne and her character and make it make sense from her point of view. So that was really important to us. Actually, she does everything by the book. Like, she is an emergency foster care provider. Like, she doesn't do anything, everything's legal, everything's, it's not common, and it's, possibly, considered unethical by her colleagues. But, on the other hand, she's helping this poor girl that they're going to, ship to put in the city, and, she could end up on the streets. And, so it was really important to us to really ground her decision making. And also, you don't, in real life, you don't know everybody's history and trauma, and people can be making decisions, and you are confident that they feel strongly about those decisions, and you don't know exactly where it's coming from, but it's coming from a place that matters a lot to them. So I think that's, we're along for the ride. We know there's something in Suzanne, and we start to get, more detail about it. And it's also interesting because it's part of Suzanne's past that she herself has tried to, put to bed, and she doesn't really want to deal with. And this is not spoiler territory, like spoilery per se, but there's a piece of her, even when she's having conversations in later episodes with somebody, like, there's still a piece for it that she just doesn't share, and she keeps for herself. That's really impactful and haunting and upsetting for her. So even though she's done the work as professionally to be where she is in her career, like, there's still parts of ourselves that we don't want to deal with. And it's, that gap in the unconscious, the difference between who you are and who you think you are. And that's the real monster, right? Because that's the blind spot. And that's the thing that that causes you to make decisions that people are like, what, why'd she do that? But it's very real for her, and she's not fully conscious of why she's doing it. So that is really fascinating to me psychologically. And it's something that I think everybody understands, whether they recognize some of those elements, unconscious elements within themselves, or can see them in other people. It's always easier to see them in other people. But it's really fascinating in terms of a character for me, and was really, really gratifying to explore dramatically.
Absolutely. And I did also want to talk about the visual elements of how you thought about the way in which you wanted to conceptualize what this cult looks like. And, there's some very distinctive visual aspects that come into that, like the raven costume, and, kind of like the use of feathers, or even just separately, the kind of tree area where May does offerings, the use of the white flowers. And so was that also kind of going back to some of the original research that you've done for the book? Were there certain things that you carried through that were from that initial research and conversations that you'd had the opportunity to have? Or how did you think about visually what would represent this best on screen?
Yeah, that's a great question. In the book, what we kept from the book was a number of elements, this sort of, Little House on the Prairie type of town as much as we could. Some other elements, which I won't say. But in approaching this series, we, cult territory is well covered in entertainment, and it's a fascinating topic, because I for me, it's it comes from an evolutionary instinct to be a part of a tribe. And, historically being a part of a tribe helped people survive in the wild. And it provided emotional connection, sense of belonging, community. And so it's a very easily exploitable human instinct that I think is sort of deep in our DNA to want to belong and be a part of something. So taking the core of that, my writer's room and I studied all kinds of cults, religions, read books, did interviews, watched documentaries. We just absorbed as much as we possibly could. And then we crafted our own unique community, drawing on some of these real things, but so it feels grounded and real, but is completely fictional and our own. And that was really important to me, to create something really bespoke and really special and unique and weird. We wrote, whole documents about the cult and their backstory and where they came from. And we gave those to our department heads. Our costume designer designed the costumes with those in mind. And our production designer I worked very closely with, and like, what is the look of this place? Like, what kind of lights do they have? Do they have 20 of the same lamps? Did they buy a batch of lamps in the 1960s and now they have another batch from the 90s? Like, we really thought through everything in really great detail. Even the color of the some of the dress that some people wear there. May mentions to Jules in a scene about dyeing fabric, that you can make colors out of dyeing out of plants, and she knows about, plant medicine. And so we really tried to create something that everyone creatively could build off of. We worked with our composer who wrote that our hymn that we play through, throughout the season at different moments. And, we gave him some of our language of the cult, and we wrote part of our cult's Bible, the Book of Covenants, and we wrote passages and we wrote stories. So it comes out in the way that the characters talk and their points of view. But, we're not always like referring to it explicitly, but it's there for us to build on. So it feels real, and it feels like there's depth to the storytelling there. We also worked with, we had a couple of incredible musical artists. Bishop Briggs did our main title song, and we talked with her about the show. And again, we gave them language about the ideology, and she wrote a stunning song. We're actually releasing an album with some of the original music from the show, which will come out the same day as the show. So very, very excited to be able to share that with people. And also another song is on there by Isabella Summers, who's the Machine of Florence and the Machine. And she wrote a stunning song, which we use in our last episode. So, but again, everything, we just worked with the artists really hand in hand to create something that felt unified and real and bespoke.
I mean, I love how many details we're going into each of these things that we see on screen in terms of visuals and in terms of the story. And I think that's why the story kind of works the way that it does in the series. So congratulations on everything with it. And thank you so much for talking about it. Really appreciate it.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you.